Have you ever stood outside at night when the world around you seemed to vanish into shadow and felt how a single flame could change everything? Imagine being on a lonely road, no lamps to guide you, no distant glow of towns on the horizon, no noise but your own steps. In that stillness, one lantern's flicker was not just light, it was hope, it was comfort, and it was also a kind of betrayal, for the very thing that helped you see also made you seen. This is why lanterns were both trusted companions and dangerous burdens for travelers of the past. Hello everyone, and welcome. In this story you will discover the hidden risks of traveling with lanterns, why a simple flame carried so much meaning, and how people balanced light and danger on their journeys. If you enjoy uncovering these overlooked pieces of history, you may gently subscribe, so each new tale arrives as quietly and steadily as these flames once lit the road. Let us step back in time, centuries ago, when lanterns were not simply tools but lifelines. Imagine the deep country lanes of Europe in the 15th or 16th century. Roads were rough, often no more than packed dirt or muddy tracks. At night, they were swallowed by blackness. Trees crowded the edges, their branches meeting overhead, creating tunnels of shadow. Without a lantern, a traveler might lose their footing, stumble into ditches, or wander off the path entirely. But with a lantern they carried a fragile circle of light, just wide enough to see a few steps ahead. This fragile light carried comfort, yes, but also exposure. The glow pierced the darkness, drawing eyes from far away. Have you ever lit a candle in a dark room and noticed how it seems to call attention to itself? How every movement of the flame feels magnified? That was the experience of a traveler with a lantern, visible to creatures, strangers, and dangers they could not always see themselves. Lanterns came in many forms. Some were simple frames of wood or iron with horn panels or thin glass to shield the flame. Others were little more than open flames carried in protective holders. Oil fueled many of them, while tallow candles burned in cheaper lanterns. Each design carried its own risks. Glass could shatter, horn could crack, oil could spill. Even the flame itself was fickle, snuffed out by wind or rain, leaving its owner suddenly blind in the night. But even when the flame burned steady, danger followed. Shadows shifted with every flicker, playing tricks on the eyes. A tree branch became the outline of a lurking figure. A stone wall seemed to move in the uncertain glow. Travelers often reported how their own imaginations betrayed them, spurred by the dance of light and dark. Have you ever stared too long into moving shadows and felt certain something was there? That unease was magnified 100-fold when the road stretched lonely before you and behind you, with only a lantern to push back the night. The greatest danger of lanterns, however, was the way they turned the traveler into a beacon. Long before the road bent, others could see the faint glow. Bandits in hiding might spot it and prepare. Wild animals, curious or hungry, might be drawn closer. Even fellow travelers, not always friendly, could be alerted by the sight of light. To carry a lantern was to announce your presence, to surrender the cloak of invisibility that darkness otherwise gave. Yet who would dare walk without one? To stumble blindly on rough paths was to risk injury, and an injured traveler was a vulnerable one. Many people spoke of this dilemma, the lantern that both protected and exposed. To use it was dangerous, but to go without it was worse. This paradox shaped countless journeys. forcing travelers to weigh their choices carefully before stepping out into the dark. Some tried to balance the risk. They shielded their lanterns with hoods, directing the light downward onto the path while hiding the glow from the sides. Others carried small, dim flames, sacrificing brightness for discretion. A few even experimented with covering part of the lantern, lifting the cover only when they needed to check the road. These tricks helped, but they never erased the central truth. Light and danger walked hand in hand. Travelers learned to listen as much as they looked. They strained their ears for movement in the dark, knowing their lantern might betray them before they saw what approached. Horses, too, reacted to unseen things, their ears twitching, their steps uneasy. Many travelers trusted their animals' senses more than their lanterns. If a horse balked or sniffed the air, its rider would quickly lower the light, hoping not to draw attention to themselves. But the most haunting danger was not always bandits or beasts. It was the knowledge that the light itself played tricks. The flicker of a flame could exaggerate distance, making obstacles seem closer or farther than they were. Ditches appeared shallow until someone stepped into them. Stones cast long shadows that looked like holes. The lantern did not simply reveal the world, it reshaped it. Have you ever looked at something by weak light and only later realized how different it truly was? Travelers faced that distortion every night. Still, the lantern remained a faithful companion. People held them tightly, guarded them with care, and repaired them when they failed. Without them, roads were nearly impassable, but with them came all the risks of betrayal. And so, to carry a lantern was to walk a path between safety and peril, guided by a fragile flame that was as dangerous as it was protective. This was only the beginning. In the chapters ahead, we will step deeper into the world of lantern-lit travel, uncovering the strange dangers, clever tricks, and hidden struggles that surrounded the simple act of carrying light into darkness. Have you ever tried to keep a candle burning in the wind? Even today, with steady wax and well-made wicks, a sudden breeze can snuff it out in seconds. Now imagine yourself centuries ago, walking a road at night, holding a lantern whose thin flame is your only defense against the complete darkness of the countryside. Every gust of wind, every shift in the weather, every crack in the lantern's frame carried the risk of plunging you into blindness. That was the fragile reality of lanterns on lonely roads. The roads themselves were no gentle paths. They were rough tracks cut through fields, forests, and hills, sometimes no wider than a cart's wheels. Stones jutted out, mud sank underfoot, and ruts carved by rain and wagons turned every step into a test. In the daytime, a traveler might stumble, but still see enough to continue. At night, with only the narrow glow of a lantern, each step was uncertain. The flame illuminated a circle no larger than a few strides across, and beyond that, the world dissolved into blackness. It was like walking with a tunnel of light, never able to see what lay just ahead until you reached it. The fragility of this light made every movement feel heavier. A lantern had to be carried carefully. If swung too fast, the flame guttered. If held too low, shadows deepened in strange ways. If tilted, hot oil or melted tallow could spill, threatening burns or even fire. Have you ever tried carrying a cup filled to the brim, aware that one careless move might spill it? That was how a lantern felt in the hand, always on the edge of failure. Wind was the greatest enemy. Open plains or valleys funneled gusts that attacked the flame from every direction. Even with shutters or horn panels, lanterns were never completely sealed. A strong gust could force its way inside, rattling the flame into darkness. Travelers often carried small sticks of resin or flint and steel to relight their lamps. But imagine doing so in the pitch dark of midnight, with nothing but the memory of your last step to keep you steady. To lose your flame was to lose your sense of direction, your ability to see danger, your fragile shield against the unknown. Rain posed another challenge. A steady drizzle seeped through cracks, dampening wicks and extinguishing light. A sudden downpour drenched everything, leaving the traveler holding a useless shell of metal and glass. Some tried to shield their lanterns under cloaks, but this left little light to see the road. Others built makeshift covers of leather or cloth, but these made the lantern heavier, harder to carry, and sometimes suffocated the flame entirely. It was a balance no one fully mastered, light enough to see, shielded enough to survive the weather, steady enough not to fail at the worst moment. The fragility of lantern light also came from its inconsistency. Flames flickered, shadows shifted, and vision wavered. A stone in the road might look like a hole, a shadow like a figure. The unreliable nature of the light played tricks on tired eyes. Travelers sometimes stumbled into ditches or tripped over roots, not because they were unseen, but because the flicker of the lantern distorted their shape. The flame revealed, but it also deceived. Have you ever stared at a flickering flame until your eyes saw patterns that weren't there? That was the nightly challenge of travelers, to trust enough in the light to walk forward, but not so much that they were fooled by its shifting dance. Carrying such fragile light also shaped the way people moved. They walked slower, testing each step, using the lantern as a cautious probe ahead of them. Groups of travelers sometimes shared the task, one carrying the lantern while others walked close, their eyes fixed on the trembling glow. When the light wavered, everyone held their breath. When it steadied, they continued, silently grateful. The fragility of lanterns meant that many travelers developed habits of preparation. Before leaving, they checked wicks, trimmed them neatly, and filled oil or secured candles. They tested the shutters, ensured the handle was strong, and sometimes carried spare materials. Yet no matter how careful they were, the road always tested them. The fragility was inescapable, woven into the nature of flame itself. And so the lonely traveler walked on, clutching their lantern against wind and rain, knowing each flicker might be the last. The fragile light was both a comfort and a constant reminder of vulnerability. Every step forward depended on that trembling flame, and every step carried the risk that it might fail. This is why lanterns on lonely roads were never simply tools. They were burdens of care, fragile companions that demanded attention as much as they offered guidance. To carry one was to accept the constant possibility of darkness, to walk knowing that safety was always as fragile as the flame itself. Have you ever noticed how a lantern doesn't just give light? It also creates shadows. The glow it casts is always accompanied by darkness and new shapes. On lonely roads, those shadows could protect a traveler by hiding them, or betray them by exaggerating every movement. A single flame could turn a quiet figure into a towering silhouette, or stretch the outline of a cart across the ground like the arm of a giant. To walk with a lantern was not only to carry light, but also to carry the strange dangers of shadows. Travelers of the past quickly learned that shadows were never trustworthy. A tree beside the road could seem like a figure leaning in. A stone wall looked like it was moving. Even one's own horse appeared strange when its shadow stretched and shrank with every flicker of flame. The play of shadow and light unsettled the mind, stirring fear where none was needed. But worse than this fear was the fact that shadows carried information to others. From a distance, an enemy might not see the lantern's flame, but they could see the moving shapes it created, announcing the presence of someone on the road. The danger of shadows was that they traveled farther than the light itself. Imagine holding a lantern close to your chest. The glow might light only a few feet around you, but your shadow could be cast 20, 30 feet away, tall and distorted. Anyone watching from a hidden place might notice the shifting outline before they ever saw the flame. In this way, lanterns betrayed their owners twice, once by making them visible with light, and again by broadcasting their movements through shadows. Some travelers tried to control this by how they carried their lanterns. Holding them low to the ground reduced the reach of shadows. Covering part of the lantern with a hood kept light focused downward, leaving less to cast long shapes. But even so, the danger never vanished. Shadows have a way of escaping control, stretching into places where light itself cannot reach. For those walking in groups, the problem multiplied. Several lanterns meant several sets of shadows, crossing over one another, moving in odd rhythms. Outsiders could mistake the group for being larger or smaller than it was. A band of merchants might look like only one or two men, or two travelers might appear like an entire company. This uncertainty could draw danger in unpredictable ways. Have you ever watched overlapping shadows on a wall and struggled to count how many figures there really were? That confusion shaped the risks of traveling in groups with lanterns. The strangest danger of shadows was how they betrayed hesitation. A figure pausing, looking around, or fumbling with their lantern had shadows that gave them away. Bandits watching from a distance could tell whether someone was confident or nervous just from the way their shadows moved. A steady pace suggested alertness. A jerky lantern revealed fear. Shadows spoke a silent language, one that was read clearly by those who made a living from ambush. Even within families or villages, shadows shaped caution. Parents warned their children not to wave lanterns carelessly, lest their shadows stretch too far. Guards on night watch used shadows to spot movement when the flame itself was hidden. But the same trick that worked for defense also worked for those who hunted the unwary. Shadows could be tools of survival or signs of weakness, depending on who saw them first. The human mind also added its own dangers to the mix. After hours on a dark road, fatigue and tension played tricks. Shadows became living things, shifting with the rhythm of footsteps, growing larger and smaller until travelers could not be sure what was real. Some spoke of hearing footsteps that matched the flicker of shadows, or feeling watched by the very shapes their lanterns created. Have you ever stared so long at a moving shadow that you convinced yourself it was alive? That was the nightly trial of many who walked with lanterns. And yet, despite all these dangers, lanterns could not be abandoned. Without them, the road was blind. With them, shadows multiplied risk. Travelers accepted this paradox, training themselves to read shadows carefully. They learned not to trust them completely, but not to ignore them either. A shadow might reveal danger, or only fear. The challenge was knowing which. So why call this chapter Shadows That Gave Away More Than They Hid? Because shadows born of the lantern's light were never neutral. They exposed travelers to watchful eyes, betrayed their movements, and unsettled their minds. To carry a lantern was to carry both light and darkness together, bound in a fragile balance that no one could fully control. In the end, every flicker of a lantern was more than just a glow in the night. It was also a message written in shadows, seen and read by anyone watching the road. Have you ever walked at night and noticed how even the faintest glimmer catches your attention? A match struck, a window glowing, a spark in the distance. Our eyes seem pulled to light against darkness without effort. Centuries ago, this simple truth shaped the dangers of traveling with lanterns. For in a world without street lamps, headlights, or glowing cities, a lantern flame became a beacon visible for astonishing distances. And while it offered safety to the traveler, it also called out silently to everything around them, "Here I am." The danger began with people. Roads were never empty. Merchants, farmers, soldiers, messengers, and wanderers all traveled by day and night. But not all of them had good intentions. Bandits, smugglers, deserters, or desperate beggars often waited near crossroads or wooded paths. In the cover of darkness they could not see far, but one lantern glow gave them all the information they needed. Someone was coming, and not only that, they could estimate speed, direction, and even number by the way the light moved. Have you ever seen a lantern swinging and immediately guessed whether it was carried by one person walking or several together? That instinct was not new. It was as old as the roads themselves. Animals, too, were drawn to light. Some were curious, others cautious. Horses grazing in fields sometimes lifted their heads when they noticed lanterns passing by, startled by the flicker. Birds nesting in branches stirred restlessly, but more troubling were predators, foxes, wolves, or even large cats in some regions. They noticed the flame, their eyes catching its glow, and they approached not because they understood what it was, but because the strange brightness pulled at their instincts. A lantern might keep away some creatures, but for others it was an invitation. Even harmless animals caused trouble when drawn to light. Swarms of insects gathered around the flame, battering against the horn panels or glass, dimming the glow with their tiny bodies. Travelers sometimes arrived at inns with lanterns coated in singed moths or clogged with beetles. The insects themselves were not threats, but they weakened the light, distracted the traveler, and made it harder to see real danger. Have you ever tried to read under a lamp swarming with bugs? Imagine depending on that same light for your safety on an open road. The strange pull of light also affected other travelers. A lone person walking without a lantern might follow a distant glow, hoping it belonged to a group or caravan they could join. Sometimes this worked, offering safety in numbers, but sometimes it brought tension, as those carrying the lantern grew nervous at being followed by an unseen stranger. The very tool meant to provide comfort could instead create suspicion. The eyes of humans were especially sensitive to light and darkness. Villagers watching from windows could track lanterns moving across fields for miles. Guards at town gates saw them long before hearing footsteps. And in forests, where darkness pressed heavily, even a faint spark shone like a star. This visibility turned every lantern-bearer into a moving target, one who could not hide, no matter how quiet their steps. To lessen this risk, people developed tricks. Some shielded their lanterns with hoods or half-covers, allowing only a downward glow onto the path. Others carried them inside cloaks until they truly needed them, revealing light only at the last moment. Still others used smaller flames, dim enough to guide their own feet, but faint enough not to be seen from afar. Yet even these precautions were imperfect. Light wants to be seen, and in the still darkness of the countryside, even the smallest flame could betray its carrier. The greatest unease came from the knowledge that someone might already be watching. A lantern did not simply help the traveler see. It announced their presence to anyone who might be waiting unseen. Travelers spoke often of the feeling that eyes followed their glow, that the night itself leaned in to watch them pass. The flame, fragile yet bright, turned its bearer into the center of attention, whether welcome or not. So why call this chapter Eyes Drawn to the Light? Because the lantern's glow was not just a tool for the traveler. It was a signal reaching out across the darkness, pulling attention from every direction. It offered comfort in its circle, but it also surrendered secrecy. To carry a lantern was to carry not only light but exposure, to step into a spotlight on roads where shadows could mean danger. Have you ever carried something for so long that its weight seemed to double, even if it was small at first? A lantern might not look like much, but for a traveler walking mile after mile through darkness, its burden grew heavier with every step. It was not only the weight in the hand, though that alone was tiring, but the responsibility, the attention, the constant care it demanded. Light was never free. To carry it was to accept its burden. Lanterns were often made of iron or brass frames, with panels of glass or horn and a handle to grip, or a hook to hang from. A small lantern could weigh a pound or two, while sturdier ones built to survive wind and rain were heavier still. For a rider, this weight mattered less, but for those on foot, every ounce felt sharper after hours of walking. A hand grew numb, an arm stiff. Shoulders ached from switching the lantern back and forth. Some tied it to poles or sticks. Others slung it from belts, but none could truly escape its demand. The lantern had to be kept upright, steady, and safe. The burden was not only physical, it was mental too. A traveler could not simply walk in peace, lost in thought, for the lantern always required attention. Was the flame steady? Was the oil running low? Was the glass cracked? Each flicker stirred worry. Each puff of smoke signaled trouble. Imagine holding not just an object, but a responsibility that might fail at any moment. That was the weight of carrying light. In groups, the burden was shared. One person carried the lantern for a stretch, then passed it to another. But this rotation came with unease. Each hand held the safety of all. If the carrier stumbled or let the lantern swing too wildly, everyone suffered. Jokes were made to lighten the mood. Don't drop the sign, or we'll be swallowed whole. But beneath the laughter lay truth. The flame was as fragile as it was precious. The burden also grew heavier in harsh weather. A strong wind forced travelers to hunch over the lantern, shielding it with their bodies. Rain made the handle slippery, the frame hot and steaming. Snow weighed down cloaks while the lantern's light barely pierced the swirling white. Each step became harder. each moment longer the flame both savior and torment. Yet even in calm weather, the lantern reminded its bearer of danger. Every time it swung, it risked betrayal. Every time it flickered, it whispered of failure. Some carried 2 lanterns, one lit, one as backup, but this only doubled the weight. Others carried spare candles or oil, but these added to the load. The lantern, small as it seemed, multiplied itself through all the care it required. The heaviest burden, though, was the knowledge of exposure. Holding the lantern meant holding the light that others could see. The carrier bore not just the weight of the object, but the responsibility of being the beacon for all. Friends looked to them for guidance. Strangers noticed them first. Enemies could find them because of it. The flame gave vision, but demanded vigilance. It was never carried lightly, even when its weight was small. If you're listening now, you might recognize how this quiet detail of history carries lessons beyond its time. A lantern may no longer be the only way to light a road, but the truth remains. Carrying light is always a burden, and just as those travelers long ago balanced its risks, we too balance what we reveal and what we hide. If you'd like to hear more of these overlooked pieces of history, you may gently subscribe, so each story arrives like a steady flame, guiding you through the shadows of the past. So why call this chapter The Heavy Burden of Light? Because lanterns were never free of cost. They demanded strength from the hand, care from the mind, and courage from the heart. To carry one was to accept weariness, vigilance, and exposure. And yet, despite all this, no traveler dared leave it behind. For in darkness, even the heaviest burden of light was better than none at all. Have you ever looked closely at a flame inside a lantern and noticed how alive it seems? It bends, leaps, flattens, and curls, responding to the smallest movement of air. Beautiful as it is, that flame is also a hungry thing, and travelers of the past knew it could never be trusted completely. The very light that guided their steps carried the risk of fire, a danger far greater than stumbling in the dark. Lanterns were meant to tame fire, to keep it safe within a frame of metal, glass, or horn. But taming did not mean controlling completely. Oil sloshed, wicks smoked, sparks escaped. A sudden tilt could send hot wax or burning drops spilling through cracks. And in a world built of wood, cloth, straw, and dry earth, even the smallest ember could spell disaster. Consider the traveler carrying an oil lantern on a rough road. Every jolt of the ground made the liquid inside shift, pressing against the wick. Sometimes the flame flared too high, licking at the top of the lantern. Sometimes it sputtered and spat, throwing sparks. The traveler, already weary, now had to keep one hand steady and eyes alert, lest their own light betray them. Have you ever carried something that seemed harmless until you realized how easily it could turn dangerous? That was the truth of fire in lanterns. Glass panels cracked in the cold. A traveler leaving a warm inn might step into frosty air only to hear the faint snap of breaking glass as heat met chill. With the crack came gaps where sparks could slip out. Horn panels, more common in cheaper lanterns, warped with heat and left crooked openings. These flaws turned safety into risk, forcing the bearer to choose, walk without light, or carry a flame that might set cloak, pack, or hair alight. The danger was worst in crowds. Picture a narrow street at night, packed with carts and people. Each person carried their own lantern or torch, the glow jostling together in a sea of flicker. One misstep, a swing too wide, a stumble too sharp, and the flame brushed against cloth. A sleeve caught, a cloak smoked, panic rippled. Shouts filled the air, hands slapped desperately, and often the fire was put out. But sometimes it spread, small and fast, until what began as one lantern turned into a blaze that consumed far more than its owner. Travelers feared this, and so they held lanterns away from their bodies, arms aching with the effort. They tied cloth around handles to protect hands from heat. Some built shields of thin metal above the flame to block sudden bursts. Each measure reduced risk but never erased it. The fire within the frame always reminded them it was servant but never friend. Accidents left memories that passed into cautionary tales. Stories told of merchants whose wagons of grain went up in smoke after a lantern tipped. Villagers remembered inns blackened by fire when one careless hand dropped a glowing lamp. These tales were repeated not to frighten, but to remind. Each listener learned that the flame which gave safety also demanded respect. And yet, despite the fear, people could not do without. They walked carefully, balanced their lanterns, checked them constantly. For without the fire the road vanished, and darkness pressed too heavily to endure. So they accepted the paradox that to survive the night, they had to carry a danger with them, glowing inside a fragile frame. So why call this chapter The Fire Within the Frame? Because the flame was both protector and threat, a constant reminder that survival often meant living with risk. To walk with a lantern was to walk with fire in your hand, knowing it could save you or betray you in the space of a single flicker. Have you ever leaned too much on something fragile, only to have it collapse in the very moment you needed it most? For travelers centuries ago, that was the cruel truth of lanterns. They were precious companions on dark roads, but they were also treacherous. When they failed, they did so suddenly, without warning, leaving their owners stranded in a blackness so deep it seemed to swallow the world whole. Failure came in many forms. The simplest was the extinguishing of the flame. A gust of wind slipping through a crack, a careless swing that shook the wick, a droplet of rain finding its way inside. Any of these could kill the light instantly. One moment the path was faintly lit, the next it was gone, replaced by nothing but the heavy press of night. Travelers described the shock of such moments as if the earth itself had vanished under their feet. Have you ever walked through a tunnel and had the lights flicker out, leaving you blind? Multiply that fear by the loneliness of the countryside, and you will understand the terror of a failed lantern. Then there were failures of fuel. Oil burned low, candles shortened, tallow sputtered. Many travelers miscalculated how long a journey would take, or how quickly a wick would consume its fuel. The moment the flame guttered and died, the realization struck. They had been careless, and now they would pay with fear. Some carried spares, but in fumbling darkness, finding and lighting them was its own trial. The longer they struggled, the more their hearts pounded, each second stretching into eternity. Structural failures brought different dangers. Glass shattered when dropped or struck, scattering sharp fragments across the ground. Horn warped in heat, leaving gaps that ruined the protection of the frame. Handles broke, hooks bent, hinges stuck. A lantern was a machine of fragile parts, and like any machine, it could betray its owner at the worst possible time. Imagine hearing the snap of a handle and watching your only light tumble into mud, flame extinguished, metal bent, hope dimmed with it. Worse still was when the lantern did not simply fail, but turned dangerous. Oil spilled, flames flared, cloth caught. A traveler fumbling to save their failing light might set themselves or their belongings alight. Such accidents were rare but remembered vividly, passed on as warnings. Parents reminded children before their first night journeys, guard the lantern, but do not clutch it too tightly. Better to lose the flame than to let it bite you. The silence that followed a failed lantern was its own punishment. Without the crackle of the wick or the faint hiss of oil, the night seemed heavier. Sounds that were once softened by light now grew sharper. The rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an animal, even the echo of one's own footsteps. The traveler stood frozen, clutching the useless frame, aware of how utterly exposed they were. Darkness was not just absence of light. It was presence of fear. And yet people adapted. They carried flints and steel, spare candles, little vials of oil tucked into pouches. They learned to relight quickly, to steady their hands against trembling. Some practiced in daylight, striking sparks into wicks until the movement became second nature. The best travelers were not those who never faced failure, but those who had prepared for it. Still, no preparation erased the memory of failure. Those who had stumbled in sudden darkness carried that fear with them forever. They never forgot the moment their world collapsed into shadow, nor the cold realization that survival hung on a fragile flame. So why call this chapter When Lanterns Failed? Because failure was not an exception, it was an expectation. Sooner or later, every traveler faced it, and in those moments they discovered the truth. Light was never guaranteed, and the courage to continue depended not on the lantern, but on the traveler themselves. Have you ever noticed how a light in the dark can pull you without effort, like a magnet for the eyes? On a quiet night, even a faint glow at a distance stirs curiosity. Who carries it? Where are they going? What does it mean? For travelers centuries ago, this same instinct carried both comfort and danger. A lantern's glow was not only a guide, it could be a lure, and those who understood this used it to their advantage, sometimes with deadly results. The simplest form of lure was unintentional. A merchant carrying a bright lantern might draw strangers who mistook the glow for safety. Lonely travelers often followed lights, hoping to join groups, avoid isolation, or find an inn ahead. But what seemed like salvation sometimes ended in disappointment or worse. The light that promised company might lead instead to a solitary stranger, unwilling to share protection. In darker cases, it led into traps, where those who carried false lanterns waited for the curious to come closer. Highwaymen were clever in such tricks. They knew the human eye could not resist following light in darkness. Some placed lanterns at bends in the road, making them look like travelers camped or resting. When unsuspecting riders approached, thinking they had found shelter, the bandits revealed themselves. Others dangled lanterns from trees or hung them along paths to draw travelers away from safe routes. The light betrayed the unwary, pulling them off course into danger. Even without human trickery, lights could mislead. Swamps and marshes reflected glows strangely, creating illusions of lanterns far away. Travelers who trusted their eyes alone sometimes chased these false lights, only to find themselves knee-deep in mud or tangled in reeds. Though such tricks came from nature, the effect was the same, the pull of light leading into risk. Have you ever followed something shining in the distance only to realize it was not what you expected? That was a nightly trial of many wanderers. Stories spread about false lanterns, retold by those who had barely escaped. They spoke of men who tied a lantern to a stick and placed it on a hill, making it look like a rider moving slowly. Others described a single faint glow left on a bridge, tempting travelers to cross, only to meet ambush at the other end. These tales were not just warnings but lessons. Light could not always be trusted, and the brighter it seemed, the more suspicious it sometimes deserved to be. But not all lures were malicious. Villagers, too, used lanterns to guide lost travelers. A lantern hung at a gate or set on a post marked a safe path. Caravans traveling at night lifted their brightest lights high, signaling welcome to those who wandered near. The same instinct that bandits twisted to harm was used by others to protect. The danger lay not in the lantern itself, but in the question, who placed it and why? Travelers developed habits to guard against lures. They learned to trust maps and memory over distant lights. They checked the ground for familiar ruts rather than chase every glow. Some even covered their own lanterns when suspicious glimmers appeared, preferring the risk of stumbling to the greater risk of being seen. In this way, they accepted short-term discomfort to avoid long-term disaster. The lantern as lure reminds us of a simple truth. Light is never neutral. It draws, it tempts, it invites. But not every invitation is safe. For the lonely traveler, a lantern in the distance was always a question, and the answer could be comfort, betrayal, or danger beyond imagining. So why call this chapter Lanterns as Lures? Because the glow that promised safety could just as easily deceive. To follow light blindly was to surrender choice, and those who survived learned that sometimes the wisest path was to keep walking in darkness, guided by memory and caution rather than by a flame that might not belong to a friend. Have you ever walked across a dark field at night and felt how far your light seemed to travel? Even a small lantern, glowing faintly in your hand, looks enormous in the eyes of someone watching from the shadows. For the one who carries it, the circle of brightness feels small, barely stretching far enough to show each step. But for anyone looking on, the glow is like a lonely beacon, cutting through darkness to announce, someone is here and they are alone. This was the strange danger of lanterns on long roads. They gave their owners sight, but they also marked them as solitary figures moving through vast emptiness. Imagine walking a mile of empty country track, fields stretching wide on both sides. The lantern's glow is all you see, yet you know that anyone in those fields can see you. The flame that steadies your heart also betrays it, making you visible in ways you cannot measure. Travelers often spoke of this feeling, of being surrounded by eyes they could not see. They described it as walking inside a bubble of light, with everything beyond pressed tightly against a glass of darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every crunch of unseen steps seemed sharper, louder, more threatening. The lantern became both shield and target, the center of a stage no one wanted to stand on. The loneliness of the glow was heightened by silence. At night, the world was hushed, broken only by the hiss of the wick or the faint scrape of boots on dirt. Each sound seemed magnified. Even the clink of the lantern's frame felt like a shout. Have you ever been in a quiet room where a single sound echoed louder than expected? Imagine that feeling stretched across hours, with only your lantern to remind you that you were not swallowed completely by the night. This is why groups offered such comfort. When several lanterns glowed together, no one light stood out as much. The beacons merged, spreading risk among many, but the solitary traveler bore all the attention. Their light was their signature, visible from ridges, hills, forests, and fields. Even when no one else was there, the fear that someone might be watching was enough to quicken the heart. Bandits understood this fear and used it. They knew that a lone lantern meant a lone person, or at best a small group. They watched for these lonely glows, waiting for them to draw closer. Sometimes they let them pass, hidden in silence. Other times they struck, the very light that had protected the traveler guiding their enemies to them. The lantern, loyal companion, could turn traitor in an instant. Animals, too, noticed. Herds stirred when a glow passed near, eyes shining back faintly in the light. Predators paused, drawn by curiosity. Even harmless creatures, deer, hares, owls, became unsettling when seen or heard unexpectedly. The lonely glow seemed to magnify their presence, making the night feel crowded though it was empty. Yet despite this, no one abandoned their lanterns. The risk of stumbling, of injury, of walking blind outweighed the risk of being seen. And so they carried on, lonely glows moving slowly along dark paths, like stars adrift on earth. Each traveler accepted the paradox. That light gave safety and danger together, and that to survive the road one had to embrace both. And here, if you have followed these stories, you may feel a quiet kinship with those old travelers. Just as they once depended on fragile flames, you and I depend on fragile memories to keep history alive. If these tales hold meaning for you, consider subscribing gently so you can walk with me again through the overlooked shadows of the past. So why call this chapter The Lonely Glow in the Night? Because to carry a lantern was to accept exposure. It meant walking with a light that comforted you, but marked you as vulnerable to all who watched. A flame in the dark was never just a tool. It was a signal, a call, a lonely glow that revealed as much as it concealed. Have you ever carried something small for so long that it began to feel larger than it was? A book in your hand, a bag on your shoulder, even a simple key clutched too tightly can grow heavier with time. For travelers of centuries past, the lantern was exactly such a burden. It looked harmless when first lifted, just a frame of metal and horn or glass with a flickering flame inside. Yet after hours of walking, it became not just an object, but a weight, a demand, a companion that pulled at the body as much as it pulled at the mind. The physical strain was simple but relentless. A lantern had to be held steady, upright, and away from flammable cloth. Arms grew sore, hands stiffened, shoulders ached from shifting the load back and forth. Some travelers tried to tie the lantern to belts or hooks, letting it swing at their side. But this made its light wobble, casting shadows that confused the eye. Others balanced it on poles or sticks, raising it above their heads, but this grew tiring quickly. No matter how one carried it, the lantern never let its presence be forgotten. The body suffered in quieter ways, too. Heat radiated from the flame, warming the hand that held it. In summer, this was stifling. In winter, the contrast between hot metal and cold air caused burns or blisters. Some wrapped handles in cloth, but then the cloth risked catching sparks. A lantern was always testing its bearer, punishing carelessness with discomfort. Yet beyond the body, the lantern strained the mind. A traveler with no light could walk freely, guided by touch, memory, and instinct. But with a lantern, they were tethered to its needs. They watched every flicker, worried over every guttering flame, checked fuel again and again. The mind could not wander, for the lantern demanded constant attention. Have you ever been so focused on keeping one thing steady that you forgot to notice everything else? That was the mental cost of carrying light. The strain grew worse with company. If you were the one holding the lantern in a group, all eyes depended on you. You were responsible for guiding the path, for keeping the flame alive, for protecting it from wind and rain. Any mistake, a stumble, a spill, a blown-out flame was yours to bear. The group might forgive, but the weight of blame lingered. This quiet responsibility added to the physical ache, making the lantern feel heavier still. Time itself made the burden crueler. A short walk was manageable, but journeys often stretched for hours, even nights. Arms trembled, backs hunched, steps slowed. Some tried switching hands every few minutes, but fatigue caught both sides eventually. Others passed the lantern between companions, yet this too carried risk. The moment of transfer, when the flame wavered, felt like the most dangerous moment of all. What if it dropped? What if it went out? That fear added another layer to the strain. The greatest weight, though, was invisible. The awareness that the lantern was both shield and target. To carry it was to be responsible not just for light, but for exposure. Every step meant balancing the safety it gave against the risk it created. That knowledge pressed as heavily as the metal in one's hand, a constant reminder that the bearer was never walking alone, even if no one else was on the road. And yet, despite all this, travelers did not abandon their lanterns. They endured the strain because the alternative, stumbling blind, lost, and vulnerable, was worse. They accepted aching arms, tired minds, and the burden of responsibility, for light was worth it. The strain of carrying it was simply the price of survival. So why call this chapter The Strain of Carrying Light? Because a lantern was never just an object. It was a constant demand, a weight on body and mind alike. To carry it was to sacrifice comfort, freedom, and ease in exchange for the fragile promise of safety in darkness. And in that exchange lay the quiet truth of every night journey, that survival came not without cost, but through the weary endurance of those willing to bear the strain. Have you ever tried to walk quietly while holding something that simply would not stay quiet? No matter how careful your steps, the object betrays you with a scrape, a clink, or a rattle. For travelers of centuries past, the lantern often did exactly that. Its frame of metal, its panels of horn or glass, its hooks and hinges, all these parts came together not only to protect the flame, but also to create sounds that carried into the night. In places where silence was safety, the lantern itself could betray the one who carried it. Silence was one of the few defenses travelers had. On open roads, footsteps and breathing were unavoidable, but with care they could be softened. Cloaks muffled boots, wheels rolled more gently on dirt than stone, and riders urged their horses to pace slowly rather than trot. The night had its own sounds, owls, wind, creaking branches, and a careful traveler could blend with them. But the lantern was stubborn. The faint ring of its handle, the squeak of a hinge, the tap of glass against its frame stood out sharply, like whispers breaking a vow of secrecy. Imagine walking through a forest path, branches heavy above, the night still as if listening. Each step you take is measured, soft on fallen leaves. Then the lantern swings slightly, and clink, the sound of metal against metal. It is not loud, but it is enough. In the stillness of the dark, such a sound carries far. Anyone listening, anyone waiting, knows at once that a traveler is near. The betrayal of silence grew worse with poor maintenance. Rust crept into hinges, loosening them until they groaned with every movement. Cracks in glass rattled with each step. Horn panels dried and warped, clicking faintly as they shifted. Few travelers had the luxury of perfect equipment, and most accepted that their lanterns would make noise. But each sound was a risk, and every risk weighed on the heart. Even the flame itself made noise. Oil hissed when it burned too quickly. Wicks sputtered when damp. Sparks snapped like twigs. Alone in the dark, these small sounds felt enormous. Travelers described how they strained their ears against the night, trying to separate the noise of their lantern from the noise of the world. Was that a spark or a footstep? Was that hiss only oil or something breathing just beyond the circle of light? Companions noticed too. In groups, those without the lantern often relied on the bearer to remain quiet. If the lantern betrayed them, everyone was betrayed. Tension built in these moments, unspoken but felt. A sharp look, a whispered warning. Steady that thing, were common, for silence was survival, and noise invited danger. The worst betrayal came in places where silence was absolute. Crossroads at night when no animals stirred. Valleys where the air seemed to hold sound like a bowl. Abandoned stretches of road where even the wind had died. In such places the faintest clink of a lantern was like a shout. Travelers remembered these moments with unease, not because they were attacked, but because they felt how vulnerable they were. Silence magnified the betrayal until it seemed unbearable. To fight this, some took extreme measures. They wrapped cloth around handles, padded hinges with scraps of leather, tightened loose pieces with twine. They carried lanterns pressed close to their chests, sacrificing visibility for quiet. Some even built wooden frames around the lantern to dampen sound, though these made the flame dimmer. Every solution carried its own cost, but none could erase the problem entirely. So why call this chapter The Lantern's Betrayal in Silence? Because even when light gave safety, the lantern itself betrayed secrecy. Its rattles, hisses, and clinks turned careful travelers into noisy ones, exposed in ways they could not control. The flame that guided them also announced them, and the silence they craved was broken by the very thing meant to protect them. Have you ever watched a candle flame struggle in a gust of wind, bending low but refusing to go out, until suddenly it vanishes with a faint curl of smoke? Now imagine that fragile flame inside a lantern, carried along a road by a weary traveler while the weather turned against them. The most unpredictable dangers of lanterns did not come from thieves or animals, but from the sky itself. Storms, winds, and rain made every step uncertain, turning lanterns into unreliable companions and sometimes into threats. travelers often dreaded strong winds most of all. Even well-made lanterns fitted with shutters or glass could not resist sudden gusts. On open plains, winds swept with such force that the flame bent and sputtered, leaving the traveler squinting at a weak glow. In valleys, air funneled through narrow spaces, whipping sideways into the lantern and testing its shields. Sometimes the flame survived, guttering but alive. Sometimes it failed, snuffed out in an instant, leaving the traveler in stunned darkness. Rain was no kinder. A gentle drizzle seeped into every gap, soaking wicks until they hissed and died. Heavy downpours drenched lanterns outright, water slipping inside no matter how tightly frames were sealed. Some tried to shelter flames under cloaks or hats, but this dimmed the light, forcing them to walk half-blind, even while their arms ached from holding cloth above the lantern. Imagine balancing protection and visibility, neither fully safe. That was the nightly choice in rain. But the most dangerous weather was storms. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolled across the earth, and winds lashed with fury. Lanterns swung wildly, their flames flaring too high, licking at the tops of frames. Sparks spat through cracks, landing on cloaks or dry grasses at the roadside. More than one fire began this way, a traveler's attempt to see the path leading, instead to burning ground or smoking fabric. The very tool meant to guard against the night became a weapon turned against its bearer. Snow brought its own cruelty. Though it did not extinguish flames as quickly as rain, it reflected light in strange ways. The glow of the lantern bounced off flakes, creating a blinding halo that made the road vanish beneath white blur. Worse still, melting snow on hot glass caused sudden cracks. Imagine hearing the sharp snap of breaking panels while trudging through drifts, the pieces falling away as the flame inside hissed at the cold. What began as light ended in shards and smoke. Wind and water also played tricks on shadows. A flame bent sideways by a gust cast long, distorted figures that made the world look unstable. Rain blurred glass, turning outlines into smears. Travelers who already feared shadows now faced worse, a storm's chaos magnifying every distortion, making the road seem alive with phantoms. The mind, tired and cold, struggled to tell truth from illusion. Have you ever squinted through wet glass and sworn you saw something that was not there? That was the storm-lit road in centuries past. To prepare, travelers invented small defenses. Some wrapped lanterns in leather covers with slits for light, heavier to carry but safer in wind. Others built shields of wood or iron around the frame, bulky but protective. A few carried 2 lanterns, knowing one might fail. Yet no trick was perfect. Weather was merciless, and lanterns, fragile by nature, could never fully resist. The greatest risk came when fire turned inward. A gust might flare the flame so high it scorched the wick or charred the frame. Oil spilled, feeding the fire until it threatened to consume the lantern itself. Travelers dropped burning lamps into mud, stamping desperately, praying the flame did not spread to their packs. In moments like these, they realized how fine the line was between safety and disaster. So why call this chapter Storms, Winds, and Lantern Fires? Because the elements were enemies that could twist a trusted tool into a threat. To walk with a lantern in calm weather was challenge enough. To face storms was to gamble with fire and darkness alike. Travelers carried on because they had no choice, but each step was a reminder. Nature could not be tamed, and the flame that guided them was always at risk of turning against them. Have you ever stood in a crowded street at night where dozens of lights flicker and sway, each one carried by a different hand? The glow blurs together, shadows cross, and the space feels smaller than it really is. For travelers centuries ago, lanterns in markets and gatherings brought a strange mix of safety and danger. Light was plentiful, but in such closeness it carried risks of fire, confusion, and exposure that were as troubling as the darkness itself. Markets were often busiest in the evenings. Stalls stretched along narrow streets, each lit by small lamps or lanterns. Shoppers carried their own lights, weaving through the crowd. The result was a sea of flames, each trembling with movement. To stand among them was to feel part of a living constellation, flickering with life. But it was also to risk disaster, for flames this close together needed only one mistake to turn comfort into chaos. The danger of fire was never far away. Cloaks brushed against open flames, sleeves swung too near, hair and beards caught sparks. A dropped lantern could shatter on cobblestones, spilling oil that ignited in seconds. In tight streets there was little room to escape. Panic spread quickly, and fire ran faster than water could put it out. Villages and towns carried scars of such accidents, and stories of them were passed down as warnings. Keep your lantern close, keep it steady, keep it safe. But fire was only part of the risk. In the jumble of light, shadows overlapped, twisting familiar shapes into strange illusions. A friend could vanish in the flicker of passing lanterns, while a stranger might appear suddenly at one's side. Thieves knew this well. They moved among the glow, using confusion to snatch purses or slip away unnoticed. A lantern lit the road, but in a crowd it also blinded its owner to the quickness of others' hands. Noise added to the danger. Markets echoed with voices, the calls of merchants, the laughter of buyers. Lanterns rattled, hinges squeaked, glass clinked together. Amid this noise, the sound of danger, the sharp crack of breaking glass, the hiss of spilling oil might go unheard until too late. Silence betrayed travelers on lonely roads, but in markets, noise betrayed them differently, smothering warnings under a blanket of sound. Travelers quickly learned to be cautious. They held lanterns high, away from cloth. They wrapped handles to steady them. Some used heavier frames built for crowds, less likely to break if dropped. Others relied on shared light, trusting the glow of stalls and shops instead of carrying their own. But none could truly avoid risk. Crowds magnified every weakness of lanterns, turning them from guides into hazards. And yet, markets remained the heart of towns, and lanterns were their lifeblood at night. Without them, trade would stop, gatherings would scatter, life would shrink into darkness. People accepted the danger because they valued the light more. The same flame that threatened also bound communities together, drawing them into one shared circle of glow. If you've been following this history, you may notice how every chapter circles back to the same truth. Light is never simple. It gives and it takes. It protects and it exposes. Lanterns were as dangerous in company as they were in solitude, though in different ways. And if you find these hidden sides of everyday history worth exploring, you may gently subscribe so each new journey of the past reaches you like a steady flame, keeping the night a little brighter. So why call this chapter Lanterns and Crowds and Markets? Because the danger of lanterns was not limited to lonely roads or storms. Even among neighbors in places meant for safety, their flames betrayed trust. They brought people together while also testing their caution, proving that light could be as perilous in abundance as it was in scarcity. Have you ever been walking behind someone at night, their lantern guiding the way, when suddenly the light vanished? One moment the road stretched before you in a trembling circle of brightness, and the next you were swallowed by shadow. That sudden disappearance of glow was one of the most unsettling dangers of traveling with lanterns. For in the instant the flame was lost, the world changed, not slowly, not gently, but all at once. Travelers knew this fear well. Lanterns failed for many reasons. A gust of wind, a splash of rain, an exhausted wick, a cracked panel, or a careless stumble. But what made the disappearance terrifying was its swiftness. Light gave people a sense of space, of control. Darkness took it away in a heartbeat. Have you ever been in a room when the power went out, the hum of electricity stopping in an instant? Imagine that, but on a road where no light waited to return. The glow's disappearance brought physical danger first. Without it, feet searched blindly for the ground. Ruts and stones, harmless in light, became traps. Horses shied, carts tilted, travelers stumbled into ditches. Injuries followed quickly, twisted ankles, scraped hands, bruised faces. Worse than the pain was the vulnerability. An injured traveler without light was easy prey, whether to nature, animals, or other people. But the greater danger was psychological. Darkness unsettled the mind in ways few could resist. The sudden absence of light created panic, a tightening of the chest, a racing of the heart. Travelers described the silence that followed the flame's death as deafening, every sound magnified into threat. The imagination filled the void with dangers unseen, footsteps, whispers, claws in the grass. Fear became a companion, often more dangerous than reality itself. Some travelers tried to prepare. They carried spare candles or vials of oil, flints ready to strike. But in the blackness, fumbling was slow. Fingers shook, sparks fell wide, and every second without light felt like an eternity. Companions huddled close, whispering reassurances, while their ears strained for noises in the dark. For those alone, the moment was worse. To stand by oneself, clutching a dead lantern, was to feel cut off from the world entirely. The disappearing glow also created social danger. Groups often relied on one lantern to guide them. When it failed, blame fell on its bearer. Arguments sparked in the dark. Why had they not prepared? Why had they walked too fast? Why had they let the flame die? Fear sharpened tempers, and unity frayed. Even when the light returned, trust was weakened. The glow could disappear, not only by failure, but by distance. On roads where groups split, one lantern might vanish into the night, leaving others behind. The sudden separation created dread, for to lose sight of light was to lose sight of safety. Many travelers hurried to close gaps, unwilling to let the glow slip away. The lantern was not just flame, it was presence, and when it vanished, loneliness grew sharp. And then there were tricks of nature. Mist swallowed lantern light, dimming it to nothing, though the flame still burned. Snowflakes reflected glow back into the air, hiding the road beneath whiteness. In these moments the glow seemed to disappear, though it remained alive, a cruel illusion that left travelers stumbling as if blind. So why call this chapter The Disappearing Glow? Because few things struck fear more deeply than the sudden loss of light. The lantern that had guided and protected betrayed its bearer by vanishing without warning. To walk at night was to accept this risk, that in an instant the world could be swallowed and the fragile safety of glow could disappear, leaving only the endless reach of darkness. Have you ever looked back on an object from the past and realized that it was more than just a tool? That it carried with it not only function but fear, hope, and memory? The lantern was one such object. It was never only a container for flame. It was a companion, a burden, a betrayer, and a guardian. And those who traveled with it never forgot the strange dangers it carried, even long after they set it down. For generations, the memory of lanterns clung to the stories of the road. Merchants recalled the nights when their flames sputtered in storms, and how narrowly they escaped disaster. Farmers remembered carrying lanterns through snow, the glow guiding them home across endless white. Soldiers spoke of long marches by flickering light, where one lantern lit a column and its failure meant confusion. Each story carried the same theme. The lantern was as dangerous as it was essential. What made the memory lasting was not just the physical risks, but the feelings they stirred. The sudden panic of a flame vanishing, the unease of shadows stretching too far, the sting of heat from metal too long in the hand. These moments burned themselves into memory, lasting long after the journey ended. Have you ever remembered not the whole day, but a single instant of fear or relief? That was the way lanterns left their mark. Communities remembered too. Villages scarred by fires begun with careless lanterns told the tales for decades. Families passed down rules, how to trim wicks, how to shield flames, how to walk with steady steps. The lessons were taught not through books, but through memory, a quiet heritage of caution born from the risks of light. Yet there was more than danger. Alongside the risks, travelers carried memories of comfort. A lantern's glow in the middle of a storm, the circle of light in which friends huddled, laughing despite fear, the relief of seeing a distant glow that meant home or camp or company ahead. These memories softened the dangers without erasing them. The lantern was not just feared, it was cherished, respected, relied upon. Over time, as roads changed and new sources of light emerged, the risks lessened. Yet even then, the memory of fragility remained. People still told of nights when light betrayed them, when fire turned against them, when shadows played tricks. The lantern became a symbol of both hope and hazard, a reminder that survival often rests on fragile things. So why close with the memory of the lantern's risk? Because the true danger of lanterns did not vanish when the flame went out. It lingered in memory, shaping how people thought about light, darkness, and travel for generations. The lantern was never forgotten, not because it was perfect, but because it was flawed, and in its flaws it revealed the quiet courage of those who carried it. And perhaps, if you close your eyes tonight, you can picture it, a lone traveler walking a dark road, lantern in hand, glow trembling in the night. They walk not with certainty, but with faith in a fragile flame. Every flicker is risk, every step is choice, and every moment is a balance between light and darkness. The memory of that struggle is what survives, a reminder of how people once moved through the world, guided and betrayed by the same trembling glow.